The mistress thought she had taken everything until I pulled out the real will in court. I never imagined my life would truly begin at my own husband's funeral. But there I was, sitting in the front pew of the somber chapel, the scent of too many lilies hanging heavy in the air as my son, David, stood at the podium and thanked another woman. He was 34, my only child, his face pale and strained under the soft lights. He cleared his throat, his fingers trembling against the polished wood. "I want to thank everyone for coming to honor my father," he began, his voice a familiar, steady baritone that cracked only slightly. He was a pillar, a man of principle. He spoke of Gerald's love for his architecture firm, his dedication to his projects, his quiet strength. I nodded, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, the charcoal wool of my dress, his favorite, scratching softly against my skin. Then he paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on a point just to my left. "There's someone here," he said, his voice dipping into a more intimate, shaky register, who provided my father with a comfort and understanding that went beyond, well, beyond everything. In his last years, she was his true sanctuary. A soft, approving murmur rippled through the room. My heart, a numb and heavy stone in my chest, gave a single, painful thud. I thought, this is it. He's going to thank me. After 42 years of marriage, of building a life, of being the silent foundation beneath his father's noisy successes, he is finally going to see me. David's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "So, thank you, Chloe. Thank you for being the family he chose." The air left my lungs in a silent rush. Chloe. The name landed not like a knife, but like a dull, heavy weight, crushing the last vestiges of hope from my body. All eyes, warm with sympathy and morbid curiosity, turned to the woman seated in the second row, just behind me. I didn't need to turn around to see her. I could picture her perfectly, Chloe, Gerald's junior partner at the firm, 20 years his junior. She would be wearing that tasteful, fitted black dress, her makeup flawless, a single, delicate tear tracing a path down her cheek. The perfect portrait of graceful grief. I, the wife of 4 decades, the mother of his child, became invisible. A piece of the furniture. A ghost in my own life. The service ended in a blur of handshakes and murmured condolences that felt directed at a stranger. People clasped my hands, their words, "He was a good man, you were so strong together," now sounding like a cruel, scripted farce. I nodded automatically, a smile etched onto my face that felt like it might crack and fall off. Later, at the lawyer's office, the final blow was delivered with sterile, professional precision. The room smelled of old leather and lemon polish. Mr. Henderson, a man who had dined at our table for 30 years, adjusted his glasses and read from the document in his hands, as per the last will and testament of Gerald Michael Pierce, executed 6 months ago, he intoned. The primary assets, including the family home in Crestwood, the vacation property on Lake Serene, and the majority of his liquid assets and investment portfolios, are bequeathed to Ms. Chloe and Davies. I heard a sharp intake of breath. It was my own. David, sitting beside me, did not flinch. He simply stared ahead, his jaw set, as if he had been expecting this. As if this betrayal was just another part of the natural order. "David," I whispered, my voice a dry rustle. "Did you know?" He turned to me, his eyes holding a strange, serene resignation. "Dad wanted her taken care of, Mom. She made him happy." Happy? The word was a choked whisper. What were our 42 years? What was I? The custodian of his unhappiness. "He said you never understood his vision," David said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Chloe did. She respected his work. His life." In that moment, sitting in that stuffy office, I saw the last 42 years of my life not as a marriage, but as a long, slow erasure. I had been the financial analyst before it was fashionable for women, sharp and ambitious. I had even worked at his firm in the early days. Then Gerald said, "Let me build this for us. You take care of the home, the heart." And I, foolishly, believing that was a partnership, not a demotion, had agreed. I had managed our budgets, raised our son, hosted his clients, and polished the silver for dinner parties celebrating his achievements. I had become the strong, silent foundation, and he had built a new house on someone else's land. Chloe, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up. She walked over to David and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Then she looked at me, and for a fleeting second, before she composed her features into a mask of somber gratitude, I saw it. A triumphant gleam in her eyes. A smile that played at the corners of her perfectly painted lips. She thinks she's won, I thought. She thinks she has taken my husband, my son, and my home. She embraced David, and over his shoulder, her eyes met mine again. That was when I did it. I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my handbag, my movements slow and deliberate. I pulled out a single, sealed manila envelope, slightly yellowed with age. I placed it on the polished mahogany desk in front of Mr. Henderson. The room went utterly still. "What's this, Eleanor?" Mr. Henderson asked, his brow furrowed. My voice, when it came out, was not the trembling, broken thing I expected. It was calm, clear, and it filled the silent room like a bell. "That," I said, my gaze locked on Chloe's suddenly uncertain face, "is Gerald's real will." The silence in the lawyer's office was so profound I could hear the faint, rhythmic tick of the antique clock on the bookshelf. It was a sound I knew well. Gerald had always loved that clock, a heavy, brass thing he'd bought at an auction. He said it's steady, unfailing. Tick was the sound of order, of a life well managed. Mr. Henderson stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. Chloe's hand, which had been resting so possessively on David's shoulder, slowly dropped to her side. Her triumphant smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, pale confusion. "What is she talking about?" David's voice was sharp, laced with disbelief. "Dad's will was clear." "This," Mr. Henderson said slowly, picking up the envelope with careful, almost reverent fingers, "is dated 2 years prior to the document I just read." He broke the seal, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. As he pulled out the pages, a single, smaller slip of paper, a faded pharmacy receipt, fluttered to the desk. I'd used it as a bookmark all those years ago. I didn't look at them. I looked at my hands, resting in my lap. They were the hands of a 68-year-old woman. Veins like faint blue rivers under thin skin, the knuckles slightly swollen with arthritis. I remembered when they were smooth and capable, flying across the keyboard of a financial terminal, my mind a sharp, calculating instrument. Our life had not been a grand romance. It had been a partnership, or so I'd believed. We met when I was a junior analyst, full of fire and numbers, and he was a charismatic architect with a fledgling firm. He was drawn to my clarity, my sharpness. "You see the bones of things, Eleanor," he'd said once, early on. "The structure. I just designed the pretty facade." Our wedding was small. Our home in Crestwood was a project we took on together, a sprawling, slightly neglected Victorian. I saw its potential in the strong bones, the original hardwood floors buried under hideous shag carpet. Gerald saw the grand entertaining space it could become. For years, our life had the scent of sawdust and fresh paint. On weekends, we'd work side by side, me sanding floors until my arms ached, him sketching designs for the new conservatory. We'd collapse onto drop cloths at the end of the day, sharing a beer, our laughter echoing in the empty rooms. Then David was born. My world contracted and expanded all at once. The firm, Gerald's pretty facade, began to demand more of him. There were late nights, client dinners, out-of-town projects. "Let me take care of the business, Ellie," he'd said one evening, massaging my shoulders as I balanced our checkbook, David asleep in my lap. "You take care of the heart. You're better at it." "This," he gestured at the numbers on the page, "it's just stress. I can hire people for this. I need you here." And I, flushed with the warmth of his touch and the weight of our sleeping son, had agreed. I quit my job. I became the manager of the home, the heart. I packed lunches and helped with science projects. I learned the peculiarities of the old house, which floorboard creaked on the third step, how to jiggle the handle of the garden tap just so to stop the drip. The scent of my life became one of simmering soups, of lemon polish on the grand oak banister, of Gerald's crisp cologne on the shirts I ironed. He was a good father, in his way. On Sundays, he'd take David to the site of whatever new building was going up, showing him the skeletons of steel and concrete, teaching him about load-bearing walls and soaring arches. David worshipped him. He saw the elegant man in the tailored suits who commanded rooms, not the man who left his coffee mug on the counter every morning for me to wash. I made a home that was a sanctuary of order and calm. Meals were at 6:30 sharp. His favorite Merlot was always stocked. The quiet I maintained was for his concentration, the clean lines and uncluttered spaces a reflection of the aesthetic he sold to his clients. I thought I was building a life with him. I didn't realize I was building a stage for him to perform on, while I remained in the wings, a stagehand in the shadows. Chloe entered our lives about 15 years ago. A bright, ambitious graduate hired at the firm. Gerald mentioned her casually. Sharp girl. Good eye for design. He started working later. There were more indispensable business trips. When I asked, his answers were smooth, dismissive. Don't be paranoid, Eleanor. She's a hard worker. That's all. I remember the company Christmas party where I first truly saw her. She brought me a glass of wine, her smile wide and easy. Gerald speaks so highly of you, she'd said, her gaze sweeping over me, taking in my sensible, decade-old cocktail dress. It must be so rewarding, creating such a beautiful home for him. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes held a glint of pity. I dismissed it then, chalking it up to my own insecurity. How ironic. I was the one being pitted by the woman who was systematically dismantling my life. Now, in this silent office, with the ghost of my husband's final betrayal hanging in the air, I watched as Mr. Henderson read the document. His eyes moved back and forth, his expression growing more and more grave. He looked up, first at Chloe's frozen face, then at David's confused one, and finally at me. His voice was hushed. Eleanor, this will leave everything, with the exception of a trust fund for David, to you. It names you as the sole executor. It's witnessed and notarized. It's perfectly legal. The air crackled. David stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's impossible. He changed it. He told me he changed it. And in that moment, I saw the final, painful piece of the puzzle click into place. My son, my own son, had known about the new will. He had known, and he had said nothing. The drive home from the lawyer's office was a journey through a city I no longer recognized. The familiar streets of Crestwood, with their grand, old trees and sprawling lawns, seemed like a painted backdrop. The silence in the car was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. David had driven separately with Chloe. I saw their two cars, his sensible sedan and her sleek coupe, away from the curb together, a united front against me. I parked in the driveway of the Victorian house Gerald and I had restored. The house stood there, a monument to a shared dream that had, it turned out, been only mine. The gables I'd fought to preserve, the garden I'd nurtured from a patch of weeds, it all felt like someone else's property. Inside, the silence was even deeper. It was the silence of a stopped clock. I walked through the rooms, my heels clicking a lonely rhythm on the heart of pine floors I'd refinished myself. I stopped at the dining room table, its dark wood gleaming under the low light. 8 empty chairs. Gerald's seat, the one at the head of the table, was pushed in neatly. I hadn't moved it since the morning of his accident. For decades, he'd sat there, his hand resting on the carved lion's head of the armrest, waiting for me to bring him his soup. Now, the wood was cold. I went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. There, lined up neatly on the top shelf, were 3 bottles of his favorite bitter IPA. I never liked the taste, but he bought a 6-pack every week. I reached for one, my fingers closing around the cold, damp glass. A habit. A cruel, mindless prison of routine. I stood there for a long moment, then put it back. I wasn't thirsty. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room in the dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the lace curtains. The first clue hadn't been a thunderclap. It had been a whisper, so soft I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it. It was about 3 years ago. Gerald had been distant, his mind always somewhere else. He'd started taking more working weekends at the Lake Serene property, a place he'd always claimed was too quiet for him. I need the solitude to think, Eleanor. You understand. I did understand. Or I told myself I did. Then, one Sunday evening when he returned, I was unpacking his suitcase. His clothes carried the fresh, clean scent of lake air and pine. But nestled between his folded sweaters was a scarf. It wasn't his. It was a delicate, expensive silk, the color of a deep emerald green. It felt foreign in my hands, soft and alien. When I held it up to him, his reaction was a masterclass in casual deflection. He barely glanced at it. Oh, that must be Chloe's. We had a last-minute client meeting up there. She must have left it in my car by mistake. He took it from me, his fingers brushing against mine, and tossed it carelessly onto a chair. She's always losing things. It was so plausible. Chloe was his partner, after all. They worked closely. A forgotten scarf was nothing. But it was the way he didn't look at me. The practiced ease of the explanation. A tiny, cold seed of doubt was planted in the fertile soil of my heart. I tried to ignore it. I was, as David would later say, too strong for paranoia. I was the foundation. Foundations don't get to be shaky. But the seed had roots. A few months later, I was looking for a receipt for our tax accountant in his home office, the one room in the house that was still unequivocally his. His desk was an organized chaos of blueprints and invoices. As I sifted through a pile of papers, a photograph slipped out from between the pages of a project proposal. It was a casual shot, taken at what looked like a firm picnic. Gerald was smiling, a genuine, relaxed smile I hadn't seen in years. He had his arms slung casually around Chloe's shoulders. She was leaning into him, her head tilted back in laughter. And standing just beside them was David. He was younger, maybe in his late 20s, and he was smiling too. Not a big, beaming smile, but a comfortable, familiar one. They looked like a unit. A trio. My hand trembled as I put the photo back. It's just a company photo, I told myself fiercely. You're imagining things. You're becoming a jealous, suspicious old woman. But the whispers were getting louder. The forgotten scarf became a forgotten lipstick in his car's cup holder. A client's, I suppose. The working weekends became more frequent. The symphony tickets he'd bought for my birthday, he'd had to give to a client at the last minute. Our neighbor, Martha, mentioned seeing him at that very symphony a week later with Chloe. I thought you were sick, dear, she'd said, her eyes full of innocent concern. Each time, I confronted the unease, and each time, I buried it. I buried it under grocery lists and garden weeding and making sure his favorite shirts were perfectly pressed. I buried it because the alternative, to acknowledge that the entire structure of my life was built on a lie, was too terrifying to contemplate. The foundation was cracking, and I, the one who was supposed to be holding it all together, was the only one who couldn't see it. Sitting in the dark living room, the truth felt less like a revelation and more like a confirmation. The clues had been there all along, littering my path like sharp little stones I'd chosen to walk over in bare feet, pretending I didn't feel the pain. I stood up, my joints protesting. I went to the basement, to a corner where we kept old cardboard boxes filled with memories that no longer had a place in the curated upstairs world. I found the one labeled Eleanor, office. Inside were relics of my past life, my old financial calculator, a stack of business cards from my time as a consultant, a few faded employee IDs. I pulled one out. The photo showed a woman with short, sharp hair and a direct, self-assured gaze. Eleanor Pierce, financial consultant. I remembered her. She was the one who sat second from the right at every board meeting, her opinions respected, her numbers unassailable. Gerald had asked her to quit. He'd promised to take care of everything. And I, that foolish, hopeful girl, had believed him. I closed the box. The seed of doubt had not just taken root, it had grown into a towering, poisonous tree. And now it was time to cut it down.
The next morning, the house felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a crime scene. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window felt accusatory, illuminating every dust mote, every tiny crack in the facade I had so carefully maintained. I made a pot of coffee, the rich aroma doing little to cut through the chill that had settled in my bones. I drank it standing at the counter, looking out at the garden. The rose bushes I had pruned for 20 years seemed to look back at me, their thorns suddenly more visible than their blooms. I had to know the full depth of it. I could no longer live in the shadowy half-truths. I started in Gerald's study, a room I had always treated with a kind of respectful distance. Now, I invaded it. I began with the drawers of his massive oak desk. They were a meticulously organized chaos of professional life, invoices from suppliers, project timelines, client thank you notes. I sifted through them, my fingers growing dusty. I found nothing out of the ordinary, just the dry paperwork of a successful career. It was all so clean. Frustration began to prickle at the back of my neck. Had I imagined it all? Was I just a bitter widow seeing ghosts? Then my eyes fell on the old wooden filing cabinet in the corner, the one he'd had since the firm's early days. He called it his archives. I'd never had a reason to look in it. The first drawer stuck, then gave way with a groan. It was filled with hanging folders, labeled by year, going back decades. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled out the folder from 6 years ago, the year my sister had been ill, and I'd spent months traveling back and forth to care for her. The year Gerald had told me not to worry about a thing at home. And there it was. Tucked between a warranty for office furniture and a stack of old business luncheon receipts, was a letter from the Nantucket Property Management Company. My breath hitched. We had a vacation home on Lake Serene, not in Nantucket. I unfolded the paper, my hands trembling so badly the words blurred. It was a confirmation of a seasonal rental payment. The recipient was a Ms. L. Mallister. The property address was a charming cottage I knew from pictures, a place Gerald had once shown me in a brochure, saying, "Wouldn't this be a nice investment?" I had agreed, never dreaming the investment wasn't for us. The paper felt like ice in my hands. 6 years. He had been paying for a seaside retreat for her while I was changing my sister's bedpan. The betrayal was so concrete, so financial, it stole the air from my lungs. I needed air. I needed a human voice, a confirmation that I wasn't going mad. I walked across the street to see Martha, our neighbor for 30 years. Her garden was a vibrant, slightly wild tapestry of color, a stark contrast to my own orderly beds. She was on her knees, weeding, and looked up with a warm, sympathetic smile when she saw me. "Eleanor, dear. How are you holding up?" We sat in her sunroom, surrounded by thriving potted plants. The air was humid and smelled of earth and blooming jasmine. I took a steadying sip of the lemonade she'd offered. "Martha," I began, my voice carefully neutral. "Do you remember a woman named Chloe? From Gerald's firm?" Her face softened with immediate recognition, then tightened with something like pity. "Chloe? Oh, yes. Pretty thing. Always so well-dressed." She stirred her tea, her spoon clinking softly against the porcelain. "I always thought they were an item, you know? She's been on this street several times. One year, she helped him put up the Christmas lights. I remember thinking it was odd you weren't out there with them." I froze. That Christmas. I had been laid up with a badly swollen knee, stuck on the sofa upstairs. Gerald had told me a neighborhood boy had helped him string the lights. I had watched from the window, seeing his figure on the ladder, and felt a pang of gratitude. Now, the memory curdled, rewrote itself. He hadn't been alone. She had been there, in my home, touching my things, weaving herself into the fabric of my life while I was incapacitated just one floor above. "Do you remember when they started getting close?" I asked, my mouth dry. Martha looked thoughtful, her gaze distant. "Oh, at least 10, maybe 15 years ago. I remember seeing her car here when you were away that long stretch, taking care of your sister. I thought she was some cousin or something. 15 years. The number landed like a physical blow. I had managed our retirement budget down to the last penny for 15 years. I had chosen his bathrobes, scheduled his physicals, and even dipped into the last of my own parents' inheritance to rescue his firm during a cash flow crisis a decade ago. And all that time, he had been building a second life, a parallel universe with golden bricks paid for with my silence, my labor, my love. I thanked Martha, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears, and walked back to my house, no, to his house, the house he had left to another woman. I went back to the basement, to the cardboard box. This time, I dug deeper, past my own forgotten career. At the very bottom, wrapped in an old newspaper, was a small, leather-bound album I had never seen before. I opened it. The first photo was of Gerald and Chloe at a beach. He was wearing a shirt I had bought him. They were both laughing, his arm around her waist. He looked relaxed, younger, happier than I had seen him in 20 years. The date scrawled in the corner was from 8 years ago. I turned the page. There was a photo of them at a formal dinner, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Another of them hiking. And then, the one that broke me. It was a picture of the three of them, Gerald, Chloe, and a teenage David, standing in front of a Christmas tree. My Christmas tree. David was smiling, a nervous but not reluctant smile. He looked comfortable. He looked like he belonged with them. In the bottom corner of the photo, to buy properties and funnel money to his mistress. There will be other unaccounted for transfers. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You're not just fixing a marriage, Maggie. You're looking to expose fraud. I'm looking for the truth, I replied. I've spent too long in the dark. We agreed to meet at her house in 2 days. In the meantime, I became a woman possessed. I went to the county clerk's office and looked up property records. I found it quickly, a sleek, modern condominium in the city's trendiest neighborhood, purchased under Chloe's name 5 years ago. The date coincided perfectly with the firm's Urban Revitalization Investment Fund, a project Gerald had spearheaded. I had even helped him review the initial proposal. The irony was a bitter pill. 2 days later, I was in Ruth's cozy home office, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. She opened her laptop, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. I pulled some archived payment records from the old system, she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. It took some digging, but look here. She pointed to 3 entries, each labeled External Consulting Support, Kint Consulting LLC. The name meant nothing to me. Kint Consulting? A shell company, Ruth said, zooming in. No physical office. The beneficiary account is listed under L.M. Davies. She pointed to one line. A payment of $75,000, dated the same month you were home recovering from your knee surgery. My stomach twisted. While I had been immobile, in pain, he had been writing large checks to his mistress. Ruth looked at me over her glasses, her expression serious. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Most people would just prefer to let it go. I didn't answer. I simply handed her my flash drive. Save everything. On the drive home, the world looked different. The leaves were just beginning to turn, a blaze of orange and gold against a crisp blue sky. I rolled down the window, letting the cool air wash over me. An old song played on the radio, its lyrics about finding strength when you have nothing left to lose. I finally understood them. Back home, I compiled everything. The photos, the property records, Ruth's financial evidence. I created a folder on my computer and named it, simply, The Truth. I was no longer the woman who buried her hurt in domesticity. I was Maggie Smith, the legal wife, the one who had been edited out of her own story, and I was about to write the final chapter. I found a lawyer, Michelle Robinson, a sharp woman in her 50s whose eyes held no-nonsense intelligence. I sat in her sleek downtown office and laid it all out. I believe my late husband systematically plundered his company to enrich his longtime mistress, I said, my voice echoing faintly in the quiet room. And I have the proof. Michelle reviewed the documents, her expression unreadable. This is compelling, she said finally. We will file a lawsuit for fraudulent conveyance and challenge the validity of the new will based on undue influence. We will get it all back. The lawsuit was filed. The news rippled through our social and professional circles like a shockwave. The elegant facade of Gerald Pierce's life crumbled in the public eye. The story was too salacious to ignore, the pillar of the community, his devoted mistress, and the wife he left with nothing. The court case was a quiet, brutal affair. Chloe and her lawyer tried to paint me as a bitter, greedy widow. They presented the fake invoices from Kint Consulting, claiming the payments were for legitimate services. But we had Ruth's meticulous analysis, proving the services were never rendered. We had the property records, the dates aligning perfectly with company projects. When I took the stand, I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told the story of the last 42 years. I spoke of the early partnership, the slow erosion of my identity, the financial sacrifices I had made, and the moment I discovered the photograph with the words, "Our little family." I spoke not with bitterness, but with a dignified sorrow that was more powerful than any outburst. The judge, a woman with wise, tired eyes, listened intently. She understood the quiet violence of being erased. In the end, she ruled in our favor. The will leaving everything to Chloe was declared invalid, obtained under undue influence. The transfers to Kint Consulting were deemed fraudulent. Chloe was ordered to repay every single cent, with interest, a sum totaling over $1.5 million. She was forced to sell the condo, the Nantucket cottage, everything. The life Gerald had built for her evaporated like mist. David did not speak to me for a long time. The illusion of his perfect father had been shattered, and he blamed me for wielding the hammer. The loss was a deep, aching wound. But I had to let him go. I had to save myself. It took years, but life, like my garden, found a way to bloom again. I sold the big, empty Victorian, it held too many ghosts. I bought a smaller, sun-filled cottage on the other side of town, a place that was mine alone, with no memories of Gerald in the grain of the woodwork. I reconnected with old friends, with Ruth. I started painting, something I'd loved as a girl but had given up for a more practical career in finance. My canvases were filled with bold, vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the muted tones of my old life. Then, one rainy afternoon, my doorbell rang. It was David. He stood on my porch, soaked and looking like the lost boy I remembered from the beach photograph. He didn't say anything. He just hugged me, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. We sat in my kitchen that night, and he finally listened. He heard the whole, unvarnished truth, not the curated version his father had fed him. He told me you were cold, David whispered, his voice thick with regret. That you didn't understand his vision. That you were too strong. I smiled, a real, gentle smile. I was strong because I had to be, David. I was holding up a world that was falling apart. Your father didn't need my strength, he resented it because it exposed his weakness. It was a long, slow process, mending our relationship. But we did. He apologized, not just with words, but with actions. He helped me hang my paintings. He came for Sunday dinners. The day he brought his new girlfriend, a kind-eyed teacher who looked at me with genuine warmth, to meet me, I knew we were going to be okay. Last week, I hosted a small gathering in my garden to celebrate the publication of a local artists' collective I'd joined. My home was filled with laughter and light. As I stood to thank everyone for coming, my eyes met David's. He was smiling, a true, easy smile. Mom, he said, his voice filled with warmth. When did you get so good at giving speeches? I smiled back at him, a feeling of profound peace settling over me. I always was, my dear. You just weren't listening. We all laughed. The sound was like music. Later, after everyone had left, I stood on my porch, listening to the wind chime sing its soft, tuneless song. The sunset was a blaze of orange and purple behind the old oak tree at the end of my street. I took off my shoes and felt the cool, damp grass beneath my bare feet. I was no longer Gerald's wife, the foundation of a crumbling house. I was Eleanor. A survivor. A painter. A mother. Whole, at last. The truth had been a painful scalpel, but it had cut away the diseased parts of my life and set me free. Life has a way of convincing us that the roles we play, the devoted wife, the selfless mother, are the entirety of who we are. We pour ourselves into these vessels, sometimes until they are empty. But my story taught me that even when you feel you have lost everything, you still have yourself. And that is the one thing no one can ever truly take from you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever had a moment where you realized the story you were living was not the one you had written? What did you do to find your voice again? I share my story not for pity, but as a testament to the strength that lies dormant within us all. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is to finally save yourself. If you've found a moment of strength or recognition in my words, I would be honored if you would subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage and renewal. Thank you for listening.